John slammed the eviction notice onto the kitchen table, the sharp sound reverberating through the small, dimly lit room as the flickering overhead light cast jagged shadows across his weathered face. "This is it, Alex," he barked, his voice thick with a volatile mix of fury and exhaustion that seemed to fill the air like smoke. "If you don't come up with the rent by tomorrow, you're out on the street. The owner's sick of your excuses, and I'm not bailing you out anymore." His hands trembled as he pressed them against the table's chipped edge, his bloodshot eyes boring into Alex with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, the walls closing in with every word he spat. Alex stood frozen, their pulse hammering in their ears as they stared at the crumpled paper, its bold red letters screaming eviction notice like an accusation they couldn't escape. For 2 years, they had been funneling rent payments to themselves, a secret they'd buried deep to shield their father's fragile pride that was now crumbling under the weight of his own assumptions. John didn't know the house belonged to Alex, not some faceless landlord, and the lie had grown into a tangled mess of guilt and fear that threatened to unravel right here in the cluttered kitchen. "Dad, please," Alex said, forcing their voice to remain calm even as their chests tightened with panic. "I'll get the money. Just give me a little more time." "Time?" John's laugh was a harsh, jagged thing, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've had 2 years of time, Alex. 2 years of dodging payments and feeding me sob stories. I've been patient. I've made calls. I've begged the owner to cut you some slack. But that's over now. They want someone who can pay, not a freeloader who thinks they're entitled to this place." His words stung, each one landing like a blow, and Alex fought the urge to blurt out the truth, to scream that they owned the damn house and had been carrying the family's burdens in silence. But they clenched their fists instead, nails digging into their palms, and swallowed the confession down. "I get it, Dad," Alex said, meeting his gaze with a steadiness they didn't feel. "I'll make it right by tomorrow, I swear." Inside, their mind was a storm of conflicting impulses. Tell him, don't tell him, fix this before it explodes. But they kept their expression neutral, a mask honed by months of deception. John's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him as he ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, the lines on his face deepening with every breath. "I don't want to do this, Alex," he muttered, his tone softer now, almost broken. "You're my kid, and I hate seeing you like this. But I've got no choice. The owner's breathing down my neck, and I can't keep lying for you." Alex nodded, their throat tight as they watched him turn toward the door, his footsteps heavy against the worn linoleum. "I know, Dad," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm grateful for everything you've done. I won't let you down again." It was a promise they weren't sure they could keep, not with the secret pressing against their ribs like a trapped animal, desperate to break free. As John disappeared into the hallway, Alex leaned against the counter, their legs trembling under the weight of what had just happened, their thoughts spiraling into a frantic mess of what-ifs and how-longs. How long could they keep this up? How long before the truth slipped out and shattered everything? The front door creaked open moments later, and Sarah breezed in, her arms laden with grocery bags that rustled as she dumped them onto the table without a glance at the eviction notice still lying there like a loaded gun. She caught sight of Alex's pale face and stopped, her brow furrowing as she set a bag of apples down with a thud. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern. "Did Dad lose it about the rent again?" Alex managed a weak smile, shoving their hands into their pockets to hide the shaking. "Yeah, you could say that," they replied, dodging her gaze. "He's pretty worked up this time." Sarah rolled her eyes as she began unpacking, her movements brisk and purposeful, filling the silence with the crinkle of plastic and the clatter of cans. "I don't get why he's so obsessed with it," she said, her tone laced with exasperation. "It's not like the owner's going to toss us out after all this time. We've been here forever." The irony twisted in Alex's gut like a knife, because Sarah didn't know the half of it, didn't know that Alex was the owner, that every payment John demanded was a charade they'd orchestrated alone. They'd told no one except Mark, their friend at the bank who'd set up the trust, and the isolation of it was suffocating, a quiet ache that grew heavier with every lie. "It's more complicated than that," Alex said, choosing their words with care as they leaned against the counter, watching Sarah stack jars in the pantry. "I think Dad's in some kind of trouble, money trouble, maybe worse. I heard him on the phone last week, and it sounded bad. Sarah froze, a can of soup halfway to the shelf, and turned to face them, her eyes wide with alarm. What? Like loan sharks or something? She asked, her voice dropping to a hushed, urgent pitch. I don't know for sure, Alex admitted, rubbing the back of their neck. But he's scared, Sarah. I could hear it. Sarah shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line as she resumed unpacking, though her hands moved slower now, less certain. He swore he was done with that crap after Mom died, she said, bitterness creeping into her tone. Said he'd clean up his act for us, but I guess that was just another empty promise. Alex sighed, the weight of their own secrets mingling with the frustration in her words. People don't change that easily, they said quietly. But I think he's trying, in his own messed-up way. Sarah finished with the groceries and crossed her arms, studying Alex with a mix of worry and determination. So what's the plan? She asked. We can't just sit here and let him drag us down again. Alex straightened, a flicker of resolve cutting through the fog of their thoughts as they met her gaze. I'm going to talk to him, they said, the decision solidifying with every syllable. Tonight, after he's cooled off, I'll figure out what's really going on and see if I can get through to him. Sarah raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched into her features. Good luck, she said dryly. You'll need it with that stubborn old mule. I know, Alex replied, a faint smile tugging at their lips despite the dread pooling in their stomach. But I've got to try. For him. For us. For this whole mess we're in. As the kitchen fell silent, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them, Alex felt the enormity of what lay ahead settle over them like a storm cloud, dark and inevitable. The truth was a ticking bomb, and whether they defused it or let it blow, nothing would ever be the same after tonight. Alex lingered in the kitchen long after Sarah retreated upstairs, the eviction notice still sprawled across the table like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave, its presence a constant reminder of the confrontation looming ahead. They paced the linoleum floor, their sneakers squeaking faintly with each step, their mind racing as they rehearsed what they'd say to John. How to pry the truth from him without tipping their own hand, how to navigate his temper without igniting a full-blown explosion. The clock on the wall ticked past 9, its hands creeping toward the inevitable moment when John would shuffle back from the garage where he'd been tinkering with his old motorcycle, a ritual that had become his refuge from whatever demons gnawed at him lately. Alex's resolve hardened with every passing minute, a quiet determination fueled by the need to protect what little stability remained in this house, even if it meant wading into the chaos of their father's secrets. The back door swung open with a groan, and John stepped inside, his coveralls streaked with grease, his face etched with exhaustion that made him look older than his 58 years. He didn't notice Alex at first, his attention fixed on wiping his hands with a rag as he muttered something under his breath, but when he looked up and saw them standing there, his expression tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. What are you still doing up? He asked, tossing the rag onto the counter with a careless flick of his wrist. Thought you'd be counting your pennies by now, figuring out how to scrape together that rent. His tone carried a biting edge, a challenge wrapped in exhaustion, and Alex felt their stomach twist, knowing this wouldn't be easy. I wanted to talk to you, Alex said, keeping their voice steady as they leaned against the table, their fingers brushing the edge of the eviction notice. About the rent, and some other stuff I've been hearing. John's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening as he crossed his arms, the air between them thickening with unspoken tension. What stuff? He demanded, his voice low and guarded, a warning threaded through every syllable. Alex took a deep breath, choosing their words with precision, aware that one misstep could send this spiraling out of control. I overheard you on the phone last week, they said, watching his reaction closely. You sounded rattled, Dad, like you owe someone money, and they're not happy about it. Is that what's going on? John's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he took a step closer, his presence looming in the cramped kitchen. You've got no business eavesdropping on my calls, he snapped, his voice rising with a defensive heat that filled the room. Whatever you think you heard, it's got nothing to do with you. So drop it, Alex, before you stir up trouble you can't handle. But Alex didn't back down, their own frustration bubbling up as they straightened, meeting his glare head-on. It does have to do with me. They shot back, their tone firm but controlled. If you're in deep with someone dangerous, it affects all of us. Me, Sarah, this house. I'm not dropping it until you tell me what's happening. For a moment, John just stared at them, his breathing heavy, his fists tightening at his sides as if he might lash out or collapse under the weight of whatever he was hiding. Then he turned away, grabbing a glass from the cupboard and filling it with water from the sink, his movements jerky and deliberate. "You want the truth?" he said finally, his back still to Alex, his voice rough with something raw and unfiltered. "Fine. I borrowed some cash a while back to cover a few things, and yeah, I'm behind on paying it back. But I've got it under control, so you don't need to play detective and make it worse." He downed the water in one gulp and slammed the glass onto the counter, the sound sharp enough to make Alex flinch. "Under control?" Alex echoed, incredulity creeping into their voice as they stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Dad, you're threatening to evict me over rent you think I owe some mystery owner, and now you're admitting you're tangled up with loan sharks or whoever. How is that under control?" John spun around, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and shame, his finger jabbing the air inches from Alex's face. "Don't you dare lecture me," he roared, his voice bouncing off the walls. "I've kept this family afloat longer than you've been alive. I don't need my own kid judging me for a few bad calls." Before Alex could respond, the doorbell rang, a shrill interruption that sliced through the argument like a knife, leaving them both startled and silent. John's expression shifted, a flicker of unease replacing the fury as he glanced toward the front of the house, his shoulders tensing. "Who the hell's that at this hour?" he muttered, brushing past Alex without another word, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall. Alex followed, their pulse quickening as they reached the living room just in time to see John fling the door open, revealing a man they'd never seen before, tall, wiry, with a shaved head and a leather jacket that screamed trouble. His lips curled into a thin, humorless smile as he leaned against the doorframe, his eyes flicking between John and Alex with cold calculation. "Evening, John," the man said, his voice smooth and edged with menace, a sound that sent a chill racing down Alex's spine. "Thought I'd drop by since you've been dodging my calls. Figured we could settle up in person." John stiffened, his hand gripping the doorknob so tightly his knuckles whitened, and Alex caught the faint tremble in his frame, a crack in the facade he'd been clinging to. "Not a good time, Vince," John said, his tone clipped and forced. "I told you I'd get the money soon. Give me a couple days." Vince chuckled, a low, grating sound, and tilted his head, his gaze settling on Alex with unsettling interest. "Soon's not good enough anymore," he replied, stepping closer, his boots scuffing the threshold. "And who's this, your kid? Maybe they can help convince you to speed things up." Alex's heart pounded as they stepped forward, instinctively placing themselves between John and Vince, their voice steady despite the fear coiling in their gut. "Whatever he owes, we'll figure it out," they said, locking eyes with the stranger. "But you're not coming in here tonight." Vince raised an eyebrow, amused rather than deterred, and nodded slowly, his smile widening. "Fair enough," he said, backing off the step. "But I'll be back, John, and next time, I won't be so polite." 2 days, clock's ticking. With that, he turned and sauntered into the night, leaving the air thick with his threat, a poison that lingered long after the door slammed shut. John slumped against the wall, his face ashen, his breathing ragged as he avoided Alex's gaze, the fight drained out of him in an instant. "You shouldn't have done that," he muttered, his voice barely audible, laced with a despair that hit Alex harder than any of his earlier anger. "You don't know what you're messing with." Alex stared at him, their mind reeling as the pieces clicked into place. John wasn't just in debt. He was in over his head with someone who wouldn't hesitate to hurt them all. "Then tell me." They pressed, their tone urgent now, desperation creeping in. "Who is he, and how much do you owe?" John shook his head, pushing off the wall and heading for the stairs without a word, his silence a wall Alex couldn't breach, not yet. As the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Alex sank onto the couch, their thoughts a tangled knot of dread and determination, the encounter with Vince replaying in their mind like a warning they couldn't ignore. They'd uncovered the first shred of John's hidden truth, but it only deepened the mess, dragging them into a fight they hadn't signed up for, one where their secret ownership of the house might be the least of their problems. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and Alex knew they couldn't face this alone. Not with Vince circling like a predator, and not with John teetering on the edge of collapse. They needed help, and they needed it fast, before the 2-day deadline swallowed them whole. Alex barely slept, the encounter with Vince replaying in their mind as they tossed on the lumpy couch, the springs creaking beneath them with every restless shift, their thoughts a relentless churn of worry and half-formed plans. By the time the gray light of dawn seeped through the living room curtains, they were already on their feet, pacing the floor as the house stirred awake around them, Sarah's footsteps thudding overhead, the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen signaling John was up too, though he hadn't spoken a word to Alex since bolting upstairs the night before. The deadline Vince had set loomed like a guillotine. 2 days to unravel John's mess or face whatever consequences that leather-jacketed thug had in store, and Alex knew they couldn't wait for their father to crack open his wall of silence. They needed answers, leverage, something, anything, to turn this around. And as they grabbed their jacket and slipped out the front door, a destination crystallized in their mind. Mark, their friend at the bank, the only person who knew the truth about the house and might have insight into John's financial tangle. The bank was a short walk across town, its glass doors gleaming under the morning sun as Alex pushed inside, the air cool and tinged with the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Mark was behind the counter, his lanky frame hunched over a stack of paperwork, but he straightened when he saw Alex approach, his freckled face breaking into a grin that faltered as he registered the tension in their posture. "Hey, Alex," he said, sliding a pen into his shirt pocket as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You look like you've been up all night. What's going on?" Alex glanced around, ensuring no one was close enough to overhear, then stepped up to the counter, their hands gripping the edge as they spoke in a hushed rush. "It's my dad. He's in trouble. Mark, bad trouble. Some guy showed up last night demanding money, and I think it's tied to loans or debts he's been hiding. I need to know what you've got on him. Anything from the bank that could help me figure this out." Mark's grin vanished, replaced by a furrowed brow as he tapped a finger against the counter, his gaze darting to the computer screen beside him. "I can't just pull his records without a reason," he said, hesitation threading through his words. "But since you're technically the house owner, and he's been using that address for everything, I can bend the rules a little. Give me a sec." He typed rapidly, his fingers clicking across the keyboard, and Alex watched the screen's glow reflect in his glasses, their pulse quickening with every second that ticked by. After a moment, Mark let out a low whistle, his eyes widening as he scrolled through the data. "Okay, this isn't good," he said, turning the monitor slightly so Alex could see. "John's been declined for 3 loans in the last 6 months. Big ones, way more than he could ever repay on his mechanic gig. And there's a flagged transaction from a month ago, a cash withdrawal he routed through a sketchy third-party lender, not our bank, but it pinged our system because he used the house as collateral reference." Alex's stomach dropped, their fingers tightening on the counter as they processed the implications. John had been gambling with the house, or at least pretending he still controlled it, oblivious to the fact that Alex held the deed. "He's leveraging something he doesn't even own," they muttered, more to themselves than to Mark, their voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What kind of lender takes a deal like that without verifying ownership?" Mark shrugged, his expression grim as he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "The kind that doesn't care about paperwork. Probably someone off the books, someone who'd send a guy like your visitor last night to collect. If John's in with them, he's playing a dangerous game, Alex, and you're caught in it too." Before Alex could respond, the bank's phone rang, a shrill interruption that made them both jump, and Mark grabbed it with an apologetic glance, his tone shifting to professional cheer as he answered. "First Community Bank, Mark speaking." "Oh, hey, yeah, he's right here." He held the receiver out to Alex, his brow creasing with confusion. "It's for you. Some woman says it's urgent." Alex took the phone, their hand unsteady as they pressed it to their ear, a voice crackling through the line that they didn't recognize, low, clipped, and unmistakably tense. "You Alex?" the woman asked, not waiting for a reply. "I'm Carla. I work at the garage with your dad. We need to talk, now, about John and the mess he's in. Meet me at the diner on 5th in 20 minutes. Don't bring him, and don't tell anyone else." The line went dead before Alex could ask questions, leaving them staring at the receiver as Mark watched, his curiosity palpable. "Who was that?" he asked, leaning forward again. But Alex shook their head, handing the phone back as their mind raced to catch up. "Someone who might know more than we do," they said, their voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling inside. "I've got to go. Thanks, Mark, for digging that up. I'll figure out how to use it." Mark nodded, concern etched into his features as he called after them. "Be careful, Alex. Whatever this is, it's bigger than you think." Alex waved a hand in acknowledgement as they hurried out, the morning air hitting them like a slap as they headed for the diner, their thoughts a jumble of Mark's findings and Carla's cryptic summons. The diner was a squat, faded building with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed faintly, and Alex spotted Carla the moment they stepped inside, a wiry woman in her 40s, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, her grease-stained overalls marking her as one of John's co-workers. She sat in a corner booth, nursing a coffee, and waved them over with a brisk gesture, her sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Alex. "Sit," she said as they slid into the seat across from her, her voice carrying a no-nonsense edge. "I'm only here because John's been screwing up at work, missing shifts, and I heard him arguing with some guy in the parking lot yesterday. Same vibe as the one you probably met last night. He's in debt to a guy named Vince Russo, runs a backroom lending racket out of the old warehouse district." Alex leaned forward, their hands clasped on the table as they absorbed her words, the name Vince igniting a fresh wave of dread. "How much does he owe?" they asked, keeping their tone even, and Carla's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers drumming against the mug. 10 grand, last I heard," she replied, her gaze steady. "But it's not just the money. Vince doesn't mess around, and John's been stalling him for weeks. I don't know you well, kid, but I've seen what happens when people cross Vince, and I don't want that on my conscience. You've got to get John out of this, or he's done, and maybe you too." The weight of her words settled over Alex like a heavy coat, their mind reeling as they pieced together the full scope of John's deception. Not just borrowing against a house he didn't own, but sinking into a hole with a man who'd already proven he'd show up uninvited. "Why are you telling me this?" they asked, searching her face for motive, and Carla shrugged, taking a sip of her coffee before answering. "Because John's a stubborn ass, but he's family to me at the garage," she said plainly. "And you're his kid. You've got a better shot at pulling him back than I do. But you're running out of time. Vince isn't patient." Alex nodded, their resolve hardening as they absorbed the lifeline Carla had thrown them, an ally they hadn't expected, armed with a truth that flipped their world upside down. John's debt wasn't just a problem, it was a death sentence if they didn't act fast. "I'll handle it," they said, sliding out of the booth, their voice carrying a certainty they didn't fully feel. "Thanks, Carla, I owe you." She waved them off, her expression unreadable as she returned to her coffee, and Alex stepped back into the daylight, the clock ticking louder in their mind. One day left, and a secret ownership that might be their only card to play. Alex strode back to the house with Carla's warning echoing in their ears, the diner's stale coffee scent still clinging to their jacket as they replayed every word she'd dropped. 10 grand. Vince Russo. A deadline that was now less than 24 hours away. The morning had burned away into a brittle afternoon, the sky flat and gray above the sagging rooftops of their small town, and Alex's steps quickened with an urgency they couldn't shake, their mind churning through options that all seemed to lead to the same razor-edged choice. Confront John with the truth about the house, or watch him, and maybe all of them, crash into Vince's fists. They'd kept the secret for 2 years to protect his pride, but pride wouldn't shield him from a man who'd already darkened their doorstep once. And Alex knew this was the moment it all came to a head, whether they were ready or not. Inside, the house was quiet, the air thick with the lingering tension of the previous night, and Alex found John in the garage, hunched over his motorcycle with a wrench in hand, the clank of metal against metal punctuating the stillness as he worked. His coveralls hung loose on his frame, grease smudged across his knuckles, and he didn't look up as Alex stepped into the doorway, their shadows stretching across the concrete floor. "We need to talk," Alex said, their voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter, firm enough to make John pause, his hand stilling on the wrench as he glanced over his shoulder, his face a mask of weariness and suspicion. "Not now, Alex," he grunted, turning back to the bike. I've got enough on my plate without you hounding me again. This can't wait. Alex pressed, stepping fully into the garage, their hands shoved deep into their pockets to steady the tremble threatening to betray them. Vince Russo, $10,000. Ring any bells? John froze, the wrench slipping from his grip to clatter against the floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the confined space. And when he turned to face Alex, his eyes were wide, his breath catching in a way that confirmed every fear they'd been carrying. "How the hell do you know about that?" he demanded, his voice rough and unsteady, rising as he stood, towering over them with a mix of panic and defiance. Alex held their ground, their pulse thudding in their throat as they met his stare, knowing there was no backing out now. "Doesn't matter how," they said, keeping their tone even. "What matters is you're in over your head, and he's coming back tomorrow, unless we stop this now." John's hands balled into fists, his face flushing red as he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You think you can fix this?" he snapped, his words laced with bitterness. "You've got no idea what you're stepping into, Alex. Stay out of it before you make it worse." But Alex didn't flinch, their own frustration surging as they shook their head, the secret they'd guarded for so long clawing its way to the surface. "I can't stay out of it," they shot back, their voice rising to match his. "Because this isn't just your mess, it's mine too, and I've been carrying it for years while you've been blind to it. The house, Dad, the rent you've been demanding from me, it's mine. I own it. I bought it 2 years ago when you were about to lose everything." The garage fell silent, the weight of Alex's confession hanging between them like a live wire, and John's expression crumpled, disbelief and fury warring across his features as he staggered back a step, his hands dropping to his sides. "What did you just say?" he whispered, his voice breaking, and Alex pressed forward, the floodgates open now, no stopping the truth as it spilled out. "I used my inheritance, took out a loan, set up a trust, did it all to keep this place so you wouldn't have to face losing it," they said, their chests tight with the release of it. "You've been collecting rent from me for a house I own, and I let you because I thought it'd keep you steady, but it didn't, did it? You're still drowning, and now Vince is at our door." John stared at them, his breathing ragged, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the workbench behind him, his world visibly fracturing under the revelation. "You lied to me," he rasped, his voice thick with betrayal. "For 2 years, you let me think I was holding this together, and it was all fake?" Alex shook their head, stepping closer, desperation edging their words. "It wasn't fake, it was real. Dad, I kept us here, but it's falling apart now, and we've got one day to figure this out. Tell me everything about Vince, or we're both done." Before John could answer, the roar of an engine cut through the air outside, tires crunching gravel as a black sedan rolled up the driveway, and Alex's stomach lurched as Vince stepped out, his wiry frame unmistakable even through the garage window, his cold smile flashing as he approached. John cursed under his breath, shoving past Alex toward the door, but Alex grabbed his arm, their grip fierce as they hissed, "We face him together, right now." John hesitated, his eyes darting between Alex and the approaching figure, then nodded, a flicker of resolve breaking through his shock as they stepped outside, the afternoon light harsh against Vince's leather jacket and the glint of something metallic tucked at his waist. "Time's up, John," Vince called, stopping a few feet from the garage, his voice smooth and taunting as his gaze flicked to Alex. "Brought back up, I see. Cute, but it won't change the numbers. 10 grand, today, or this gets ugly." Alex stepped forward, their heart pounding but their voice steady as they locked eyes with him, drawing on every ounce of strength they had left. "You're not getting a dime," they said, their words deliberate and unflinching. "This house is mine, legally, paid for, and off-limits to whatever scam you're running. John doesn't own it, so your leverage is gone. Walk away, or I call the cops with every detail I've got on you." Vince's smile faltered, his hand twitching toward his waist as he assessed them, the shift in power crackling in the air, and John stepped up beside Alex, his voice hoarse but firm. "She's telling the truth," he said, glancing at Alex with a mix of shame and something like pride. "I've got nothing left to give you, deals off." For a moment, Vince just stared, his jaw tight. Then he let out a low laugh, stepping back with a mocking salute. "Smart play," he said, his tone icy. "But this isn't over. I don't forget debts or faces." Watch your backs." He slid into his car and peeled out, gravel spitting under his tires, leaving Alex and John standing in the dust, the adrenaline draining from them as the reality of their stand sank in. Alex turned to John, their legs unsteady as they faced him, the confrontation with Vince eclipsed by the raw vulnerability in his eyes. Anger, relief, regret, all tangled together. "You should have told me," he said quietly, his voice cracking, and Alex nodded, exhaustion washing over them as they replied. "I know, but I couldn't lose you to this place." John looked away, his hands shoving into his pockets, and Alex knew this wasn't the end, not of Vince's threat, not of the rift they'd just carved, but they'd faced the greatest challenge together, and for now, that was enough to keep them standing. The dust from Vince's tires still hung in the driveway as Alex and John stood in the fading light, the silence between them stretching taut and heavy, a fragile thread that could snap with a single wrong word. Alex's legs felt like they might give out, the rush of facing Vince down leaving them hollowed out, their pulse still thudding in their ears as they watched John shuffle toward the garage door, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look smaller, older than he had just hours ago. They'd won a battle. Vince was gone, for now. But the cost was etched into the lines of John's face, the betrayal of Alex's secret ownership mingling with the shame of his own failures. And Alex knew this wasn't a clean victory, not when the air crackled with unspoken questions and the threat of Vince's parting words lingered like a shadow over the house they'd fought to keep. John stopped at the threshold, his hand resting on the doorframe as he turned back to Alex, his voice low and rough, carrying the weight of everything they'd just dodged. "You think that's it?" he asked, his eyes searching theirs, a flicker of hope warring with the exhaustion in his tone. "You think he'll just walk away because you threw some legal jargon at him?" Alex stepped closer, their hands shoved deep into their jacket pockets, their breath visible in the cooling air as they shook their head, honesty forcing its way through the fatigue. "No, I don't," they said, meeting his gaze squarely. "He's not done. He'll come back. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. But we've got time now, Dad, time to figure out how to handle him, and we'll do it together." John let out a shaky breath, his fingers tightening on the frame as he looked away, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. "Together," he repeated, the words sounding foreign in his mouth, and Alex caught the glint of tears in his eyes before he blinked them back, his pride still clinging to him even now. "I don't even know where to start, Alex. 2 years you've been carrying this, and I've been too damn stupid to see it. How do I trust you after that?" The question hit Alex hard, a punch to the gut they hadn't braced for, and they swallowed against the lump rising in their throat, their voice steady despite the ache behind it. "You don't have to trust me right away," they said, taking another step toward him. "But you've got to let me help. You can't keep running from this alone, not anymore." Before John could respond, Sarah's voice cut through from the house, sharp and urgent as she appeared in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed tight across her chest, her dark hair spilling loose from its bun. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, her eyes darting between them, wide with alarm as she stepped onto the porch. "I saw that car peel out. Did something happen? Are you okay?" Alex glanced at John, a silent question passing between them, and he gave a small nod, a reluctant surrender that let Alex take the lead. "We're fine," they said, turning to Sarah, their tone calm but firm. "It was Vince, the guy Dad owes money to. He came for a shakedown, but we sent him packing. It's not over, though. We need to talk, all of us." Sarah's face paled, her hands dropping to her sides as she processed the words, and she marched down the steps, closing the distance with a fury that made Alex brace themselves. "You owe money to someone like that?" she snapped, rounding on John, her voice rising with every syllable. "After everything we've been through, you're still pulling this crap? And Alex, why didn't you tell me?" John flinched, his hands raising in a weak defense, but Alex stepped between them, their own frustration bubbling up as they faced her. "I didn't tell you because I've been holding this mess together alone," they said, their words spilling out fast and raw. "The house, it's mine, Sarah. I bought it 2 years ago to keep us from losing it, and I've been paying Dad rent to keep him from knowing. But it's all out now, and we've got bigger problems. Vince isn't going away unless we deal with him." Sarah stared at them, her mouth open, the anger draining from her as shock took its place, and she sank onto the porch steps, her hands running through her hair, as she struggled to catch up. Yours? She whispered, her voice trembling, and Alex nodded, kneeling beside her, their exhaustion bleeding into every movement. Yeah, mine, they said, softer now, reaching for her hand. I didn't want it to come out like this, but it's done, and we've got to stick together, or we're all screwed. John watched from the garage doorway, his silence heavy, and after a moment, he shuffled over, sitting on the step above Sarah, his voice barely audible as he spoke. She's right, he said, looking at his daughter, then at Alex. I messed up bad, but I'm not running this time. Whatever's coming, we face it. The three of them sat there, the porch creaking under their weight, the night settling in around them with a quiet that felt more like a pause than a resolution, each grappling with the pieces of their fractured family now laid bare. Alex leaned back against the railing, their mind turning over the day's chaos. Vince's retreat, John's confession, Sarah's shock, and they knew this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Vince would return, his threat wasn't empty, and the 10 grand still hung over them like a debt they couldn't outrun, not without a plan they didn't yet have. We need to get ahead of him, Alex said finally, breaking the silence, their voice carrying a resolve that steadied them all. Find out who he answers to. Maybe turn the tables. Mark at the bank might know more, and Carla's already in our corner. We're not helpless. John nodded, his hands clasped between his knees, a flicker of determination cutting through the defeat in his posture. I'll talk to some guys at the garage, he said, his tone gruff but certain. See if anyone's heard of Russo's crew. Might give us an edge. Sarah squeezed Alex's hand, her grip tight as she looked up at them, her eyes fierce despite the weariness creeping in. I'm in too, she said, her voice steady now. Whatever it takes, we're not losing this house. Not after all this. Alex managed a small smile, the first real one in days, and squeezed back, the bond between them a lifeline in the uncertainty ahead. As they sat there, plotting their next move under the dim glow of the porch light, Alex felt the weight of the secret lift, replaced by a shared burden that somehow felt lighter, even with Vince's shadow still lurking. They'd survived the day, held their ground, but the fight wasn't over. Whether they could outsmart Vince, protect the house, and rebuild what they'd nearly lost remained unanswered, a question that gnawed at Alex as the night deepened. Victory was theirs for now, bitter and incomplete, and as they looked at John and Sarah, they wondered if trust could be stitched back together, or if this fragile alliance would hold when Vince came calling again, a moral tangle that left them staring into the dark, waiting for the next move.